Chapter 7. The next morning, shortly before the 10th hour, a knock sounded on their door. They had just got back to their apartment after paying a visit to the stables to make sure that Shadow, Nightwind, and Racer were comfortable and well taken care of. All three horses were happy to see them and seemed well content with their enforced idleness after their grueling journey. When Lhounds opened the door, Petros was standing there. After a courteous greeting, the houseman asked them to follow him to the garden. "There has been a slight change of plan," he said. "Queen Aruda is waiting for you in the bamboo summerhouse and requests that you join her there." They duly followed the houseman through the palace and then down through the extensive and beautifully laid out and terraced gardens until they reached the summerhouse that Petros had mentioned. Through the wide arched opening in its front, they could see Queen Aruda sitting on one of the curved and cushioned benches that followed the round shape of the charming dome-shaped structure. She rose to greet them, then thanked Petros and asked him to serve them herb tea in the audience chamber in an hour's time. "There will be 8 of us," she informed him. "Please see if the kitchen still has some of those delicious citron-flavored oat squares that Mr. Sand made a few days ago." As the smiling houseman nodded and withdrew, Queen Aruda asked them to look closely at the construction of the summerhouse. "As you can see," she pointed out, "it is made of live bamboo that has been laced together and has grown together to form this perfect dome shape." She led them outside to look at the outer surface of the summerhouse. "Do you see how the outside is covered in green growth that the gardeners keep clipped short to maintain it neatly? In time, as the new growth keeps being trimmed and regrows and is trimmed again, the whole structure becomes covered with a dense green living layer over some old leaves that have died and have in effect formed a dense layer of thatch. So one ends up with a living structure that is completely watertight. The design is based entirely on the way the inhabitants of the huge southern bamboo forests have built their homes for centuries, and still do." They all expressed polite but slightly puzzled interest. Queen Aruda smiled. "Bear with me. Everything will become clear to you in due course." She walked back into the summerhouse, and then through into a covered, domed passage that opened off its back wall. She led the way through the short tunnel into a little circular enclosure, completely walled in bamboo as well, that had been cut off at a height of about 7 feet. She took them over to the far wall and asked them to look back at the passageway and the summerhouse behind it. This passageway and the enclosure are also based on structures found throughout the bamboo forests. "I don't know how much you know about the bamboo forests and industry?" she asked them, and looked questioningly from one to the other. Lhounds said that all he basically knew was that he had heard it was a very dangerous industry, and Anmar and Dane both commented that all they knew was that bamboo was reputed to be a very popular and versatile building material that was in great demand, particularly in the Gordo lowlands. Queen Aruda nodded. "Yes, both those bits of knowledge are accurate. Bamboo is in fact extensively used for all sorts of purposes throughout the Gordo lowlands. You might have noticed that a lot of bamboo was used in the construction of the huts up on the plateaus, for instance." They all nodded, and Lhounds mentioned that he had been amazed to see that all the scaffolding on the building sites that they passed through on their way through the city seemed to be made from bamboo. "Yes, indeed," Queen Aruda continued. "Bamboo is light and remarkably strong, so it is easy to transport and work with. But let's sit over here so we can talk more comfortably." She walked over to 2 benches that were set against the outside wall of the little enclosure, one on each side of a small lily-grown pond. Once they were seated, she looked at Lhounds and asked, "Why did you say that you thought the bamboo industry was dangerous, Captain Denarian?" Lhounds looked a bit nonplussed, but then said, "This is probably completely inaccurate, Your Highness, but isn't there a really dangerous and bloodthirsty type of large forest cat or something that preys on the people in the bamboo forests?" Queen Aruda nodded. "That is indeed the case, except that there are 2 creatures that pose a great threat to the inhabitants of the bamboo forests. The first, as you said, is a very large cat that the locals simply refer to as the Deathstalker, which will give you some idea of the fear that these predators inspire. They are quite impossible to tame. Young kittens that have been found in the forest and brought up by humans have always turned on their owners, without fail, on reaching maturity or even earlier. The other big threat to the forest inhabitants is a large carnivorous lizard with a very poisonous bite that almost invariably proves fatal. They are not quite big enough to kill a fully grown human on their own, but as they hunt in packs, they have been known to band together to drag humans into the forest and kill them. And even if somebody should manage to escape from such an attack, as I have said, the wounds inflicted almost always mortify, leading to a very unpleasant death." Queen Aruda's voice was grim as she passed on this information to them. Then her face lightened. "But the bamboo forest dwellers have proved remarkably ingenious in dealing with these threats. All the villages and the fields that they cultivate are surrounded by thick living bamboo walls, more than twice the height of the wall around us here in this little enclosure. They are constantly kept trimmed, both inside and out, and a clear space is maintained around the outside of the enclosures at all times. And all the villages are connected by passages or tunnels just like the little one I have grown here, except bigger and much, much longer. Queen Neruda pointed at the tunnel leading from the little walled garden where they were sitting to the Summerhouse. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of parsecs of these tunnels crisscrossing the forests, connecting the numerous villages, their fields, and the areas where bamboo is being harvested. What is really remarkable is that a workable tunnel takes less than a year to grow. They use a particularly quick-growing and very flexible bamboo for the tunnels. The bamboo is first grown in what they refer to as the nursery groves. The bamboo rootstock is planted in small sacks, loosely woven from bamboo fiber and leaves, and filled with a very nutrient-rich humus that the forest people prepare themselves. When the bamboo plants are about 8 or 9 feet tall, after only about 3 moons, if you can believe it, they are planted where the new tunnel is needed. The young bamboo is planted closely together alongside each other and still in their sacks so that there is no root damage, in very well fertilized furrows, in 2 rows about 15 feet apart. This is generally the width of the tunnels that they construct, though some are wider and some can be narrower. And the bamboo immediately starts growing as if possessed. I couldn't believe how fast our little tunnel here grew. Within 2 moons the bamboo has generally grown at least another 5 or 6 feet, and then the tunnel can start to be properly constructed. The tips of the young bamboo are bent towards each other over the 15 feet or so that separate the 2 rows and tied together, so that the 2 rows of bamboo plants start growing past each other and interweaving and lacing themselves together. Even at this stage, the tunnel begins to offer significant protection, and tunnel construction workers can start to work on it in relative safety, without the protection of spearmen and women standing guard all the time. And as the bamboo matures and thickens, the tunnel becomes ever stronger and more impenetrable. The forest dwellers in fact see these tunnels as an extension of their living space. Children play and run races in them. Horses are often stabled in them, and people sleep in them when they travel from one village or working area to another. There are tunnels in the forests which are well over 100 years old, some still alive and growing, others dead but still strong and impenetrable, especially with new growth around them. There are, of course, hundreds of parsecs of ordinary tracks and roads in the forest as well, but people can only use them safely when they are accompanied by armed spear carriers, so everybody prefers the freedom of movement and the safety that the tunnels give them. When the Queen fell silent, Lhounds wondered why she had told them all about these tunnels in the bamboo forests in such detail. Whereas it was all very interesting, he failed to see the reason for it. But he had absolute faith in the Queen. They would find out soon enough why she had considered it necessary to inform them in such depth about the tunnels that the dwellers of the bamboo forests constructed. After this, the Queen stood up. "Come, I want you to have a closer look at our little tunnel here." When they entered the tunnel, she drew their attention to how closely and impenetrably the bamboo had woven itself together. "It looks really, really strong," Anmar remarked, and leant her full weight against the side of the tunnel. The Queen agreed and added, "And of course it would be very dark in here," she pointed out, "if it wasn't for these circular isingplex window panes that are set in the sides of the tunnel every 10 feet or so." She asked Dane to see if he could push the pane out or break it, and though Dane tried to do so, tentatively at first and then with much more force, the strong clear pane was held immovably embedded in the living bamboo that had been trained around it. In the forests they also have short, thick bamboo pipes horizontally set in the sides of the tunnels, close to the top for added ventilation every few feet or so. We didn't bother with that, of course, because our tunnel is so short. And finally, to allow them to get in and out of the tunnels and into the forest itself, they also have doors set in the side every 400 or 500 feet along the tunnels. The Queen went on, and having to tug quite hard, swung aside a small, curved, door-shaped section of the tunnel wall that they had not noticed before. The leather straps that held it in place instead of conventional hinges were virtually invisible against the bamboo. As you can see, the door fits very snugly and is almost invisible. Of course, we didn't bother with a fastening here, but in the forest the doors are equipped with 2 big bolts so that they can be fastened on the inside of the tunnel. The whole system is remarkably ingenious, don't you think? Queen Neruda concluded. The Queen walked through the tunnel into the Summerhouse, and in the brighter light consulted the timepiece that hung on her breast from a delicately braided chain around her neck. "Ah, it is later than I thought," she exclaimed. "Come, my advisers will be waiting for us." She briskly preceded them back through the gardens and palace to her audience chamber. About halfway there she stopped abruptly and turned to face them. Will it offend you if I call you by your first names? I really would prefer it. Anmar spoke for all of them when she said, "We would be honored, Your Highness." "Good," the Queen replied, "and you are very welcome to just call me ma'am, though people don't seem to be able to get into that habit very easily." She turned and led the way again at her usual vigorous pace. On reaching the audience chamber, Lhounds noticed that the table that they had sat at the previous day had been extended by an extra section in the middle, thus making it oval-shaped and longer, and able to accommodate more chairs. 4 people were already seated there when the travellers walked in with the Queen. Petros was just leaving, having obviously just set out the tea that the Queen had requested. As the 4 people already seated courteously rose to their feet, Lhounds recognized one of them. It was the Queen's rather officious senior scribe, whom they had met the previous day on their arrival. Queen Neruda referred to the other 3, 1 man and 2 women, as "my 3 closest and most trusted advisors." She introduced them as Councillor Admeta, a small, compact, middle-aged, vigorous-looking woman with mischievous eyes; Councillor Padum, a tall, rather cadaverous man, without a single hair on his head, but with a humorous quirk to his generous mouth; and Councillor Rade, an extraordinarily beautiful woman in early middle age, with the most unreadable expression on her perfect countenance that Lhounds had ever seen. "And of course," the Queen concluded, "you met my senior scribe and most trusted aide, Alan Mitran, yesterday." In turn, she introduced the 3 travellers to the councillors. The Queen requested Councillor Admeta to dispense the tea, which she did with brisk efficiency. The citrony oat biscuits were indeed delicious. After the tea things had been cleared away, Alan Beechan provided them all with writing materials, and then seated himself on the Queen's right at the head of the table. The Queen leant back in her chair, and in what Lhounds, Anmar, and Dane would come to recognize as a characteristic gesture, ran the fingers of her right hand over her forehead, and then down the side of her face. "Lhounds," she said. The first time the Queen had called him by his name, Lhounds realized. "With your permission, and at the risk of setting a possibly dangerous precedent, I want Zand here. Will you call him, please?" As Lhounds nodded and sat back in his chair and composed his mind prior to sending "Zand" into mind space, he was conscious of a momentary mind protest, quickly suppressed from the senior scribe. Then his mind made contact with the Lhounds. There was no mistaking the enthusiasm with which Zand responded.
"Lhounds, where have you been?"
Warmth flooding his mind, Lhounds summoned the Lhound to come to the antechamber. As Zand sent,
"We'll be there soon,"
Lhounds leant towards the Queen and reported that Zand was on his way. She reached out to the recessed button in the tabletop, saying, "I had better tell them to let him in." But Lhounds shook his head rather ruefully, and said with a resigned and long-suffering tone to his voice, "He will do that himself, I am afraid, Your Highness." The Queen looked at him searchingly for a moment, then gave a spontaneous and joyful peal of laughter. "I am sure that he will, the dreadful, dreadful beast." Her face was still lit with the residual warmth of a smile when the door opened a minute or so later, and Zand, looking even more massively lethal than normal in these luxurious and civilized surroundings, walked into the room past a rather startled Miller who was holding the door open for him. The Lhound strolled across the carpet in his normal, unhurried fashion, ostentatiously on his very best behavior, and positioned himself next to Lhounds, but with golden lion eyes fixed on the Queen. As Lhounds put his arm up and around the big throat and pulled the Lhound close to him, he was conscious of a fair amount of perturbation from the 3 councillors as well. A Lhound in the Queen's audience chamber was clearly not an everyday occurrence. But the Queen moved on to business immediately, without making any particular reference to the Lhound, who remained standing next to Lhounds in a relaxed fashion. After activating the shields on the audience chamber, Lhounds suspected this was a normal and sensible everyday precaution in a largely telepath community, and another briefly shared glance with the Lhound and Lhounds, the Queen looked at her scribe and the 3 councillors in turn. "At our meeting earlier this morning," she said, "I acquainted you with all the information that Captain Denarian and his travelling companions brought to me as emissaries from my son, the King, and Governor Delon Lanek from the province of Lanatek, respectively. I also gave you a brief description of their journey here and the hardships they endured during that journey. And, in concert with all 4 of you, we speculated about all these matters, in the light of things that we know and that our visitors are unaware of. The purpose of this meeting is in part to give them the information that we have, and then to ask them to speculate with this new knowledge in mind. It is my considered opinion that they all, and for the briefest of moments, the Queen's eyes rested fully on Zand, have a very valuable contribution to make in this regard. I have been very impressed not only with their dedication, endurance, and commitment, but also the personal and mental capacities that they possess, and that constitute, I believe, valuable assets to strengthen our cause. It is in view of these qualities that I have decided to include them in our deliberations, a step that some of you, the members of my inner council, may find somewhat unusual, possibly even somewhat ill-advised. However, the Queen continued, I have not passed on everything that I have learned from and about our visitors to you yet. I will start with Mr. Dane Lennec. Dane half rose in his chair in amazement at being singled out like that, but sat back when Anmar laid a calming hand on his forearm. The Queen smiled at him, then spoke to the meeting as a whole again. Mr. Lennec is an untrained telepath, but I believe that his qualities definitely constitute one of those assets that I referred to just now, as I have not seen so much natural aptitude in anybody for quite some time. Dane has what I can only describe as a fearless quality, and a psychic honesty and warmth that is heartening to encounter. And he is obviously a very powerful young man physically as well. So I want to start him on Lhound telepath training immediately, if that is acceptable to you, Dane, of course. Dane's enthusiastic approval was evident to everybody. In fact, he gave every sign of being willing to leap out of his chair and start his training there and then. The Queen's smile deepened. And then I was wondering if he would not make an excellent candidate as a new handler for Marox. There was a moment's silence, then a smile spread over the countenances of all three councillors as well. Councillor Padam in particular nodded enthusiastically. That is an inspired idea, Your Highness. I think they should do very well together. Marox has been very bored and aimless, and becoming a bit of a handful as a result of that, Colonel Malak was telling me. It is a pity Marox and Randall did not work out, but I suspected from the beginning that Marox was a bit too strong for him, though they seemed to make a promising start. Good, the Queen said. Then that is settled. May I ask you to take Dane round to the barracks after our meeting, Padam, and organize things with Colonel Malek? As Councillor Padam agreed, the Queen's eyes moved to Leonard and Zand. I want you both to be there when Dane meets Marox, she said. As said before, he is a bit of a handful, and I do not want him and Dane to get off on the wrong foot and possibly spoil what I believe could be an excellent partnership. Leonard and Zand both sent low-energy but affirmative mind nods to the Queen. After this, Queen Aruda's eyes moved from councillor to councillor, and then lingered for a long moment on Anmar's face. She took a deep breath and gripped the arms of her chair. When the Queen spoke again, it was almost hurriedly, but yet tentatively, and with obvious reservations at the same time. I have great doubts about this, she said, shaking her head, but after truly exhaustive thought and much soul-searching, I want to try and partner Anmar with Zendra, if Anmar is prepared to take the emotional and psychic risk. Anmar sat forward in obvious startlement, an emotion clearly shared by the three councillors and scribe. When the Queen spoke to her, her voice was very gentle and filled with sympathy. May I tell the meeting about Marda, Anmar? As Anmar nodded wordlessly, sadness clearly written on her face, the Queen continued in the same quiet tone of voice. Anmar lost a Lhound that she was very close to almost 2 years ago, and still feels the loss very keenly. One look at Anmar's distressed face bore this out eloquently. If anybody can empathize with Zendra's loss, the Queen continued, it is Anmar. Also, and the main reason why I think that Anmar may be uniquely qualified to take on Zendra's rehabilitation, touches on one of those valuable assets that I believe Leonard and his party bring to our cause. I strongly suspect, indeed I have no doubts about it, that Anmar, apart from being an exceptionally powerful sender, is also one of those rare beings, a true sensitive. She reads and interprets mind space virtually effortlessly. This time Anmar looked at the Queen in even greater amazement. But remarkably, soon she sat back in her chair with a quiet, "Ah, yes, I do see," while a look of comprehension stole over her face. The Queen realized that Anmar's quick mind had already made the leap to understanding why she had known that Zand was shielding Leonard and Dane in the Rickle Inn, whilst they had remained completely unaware of it. The Queen continued, "So I believe that if it is at all possible for Zendra to be helped, Anmar can do it." There were a few long moments of silence. Then, just as Anmar leaned forward to speak, Councillor Admeta said hesitantly and with obvious concern as well, "But surely, Your Highness, Zendra is far too compromised to ever form a workable bond with anybody again. The only reason she is even alive still is because she is pregnant and she won't kill her unborn pups along with herself. She only feeds, and that with extreme reluctance, because she knows she has to do so for her pups to live. The minute they are born and safely fostered, she will be gone. Lounge Surgeon Dell told me that herself just a few days ago." "I know," the Queen said, but Zendra is such an exceptional Lound that it will simply break my heart to lose her. I first thought of trying to put her with Callan, that very promising young telepath who joined us from Belfane recently, but rejected that idea. He is not quite experienced enough, and of course Zendra had a female handler before, and as we know, changing handlers is more likely to succeed if the new handler is the same gender as the old one. Now Anmar did speak, concern written all over her beautiful face. "But what happened to her, Your Highness?" she asked. The Queen gave a deep sigh and another pitying shake of the head. Zendra and her handler were out with a platoon of the Lound Regiment on protection duty in the bamboo forests down south, about 2.5 moons ago, and Zendra's handler was bitten by a tox lizard, as they call those carnivorous lizards down there. Zendra killed the lizard immediately, but her handler, Rowan, died because the wound mortified, as they invariably do. Zendra blames herself bitterly that she didn't manage to kill the lizard before it got to Rowan. There was a long moment's silence before the Queen spoke again. Her voice was now even heavier with sorrow. What made it immeasurably worse was that Zendra in the end had to kill her handler herself. Rowan was in such agony that she begged her and begged her to do it. So she blames herself for that too, and also that she did not do it sooner and allowed Rowan to suffer as long as she did before she could bring herself to do what is an almost impossible thing for a Lound to do. It runs counter to every instinct and principle of the Lound-handler relationship. The medics had run out of pain medication, though I will never understand how that could possibly have come about, and it was really a most terrible situation for everybody concerned, but in particular for Zendra. She is in such emotional and mental torment that she literally cannot wait to die. But as I said, I have thought long and hard about it. I spoke to Colonel Malek about it yesterday evening, and he is willing to try, if, as I said, Anmar is prepared to take the risk. And it will be a risk, Anmar. I cannot emphasize that enough. Zendra is laboring under a load of unbearable mental and emotional pain. She might lash out mentally and mind-burn you. I truly do not know if there is anything you can do, but if you are prepared to try, we will be eternally grateful. And as Anmar nodded, her face now drawn with distress at the thought of Zendra's desperate plight, a mind-send of great power and intensity blazed into the minds of everybody around the table.
Zand and Leonard will help. We will help Anmar with Zendra. Zand felt her pain last night already.
After a moment of shocked incredulity, during which startled glances flew from face to face, and real and mind space fairly buzzed and fizzed with questions, the Queen said, "With your permission, Leonard," and at his nod beckoned to Zand. The Lound left Leonard's side to walk across and stand next to the Queen, where she was seated at the top of the table. "And this, ladies and gentlemen," she said in a ruefully amused and slightly resigned tone, "is another of those valuable assets that I referred to earlier. Officially meet Leonard's Lound, Zand. He seems to specialize in dramatic entrances into mind space." In an unconscious copy of Leonard's gesture, she curved an arm under and up the side of the huge neck, and laid a gentle hand just for the briefest touch against the side of the broad head, level with her own. The Lound stood quietly next to Queen Eruda, but for a few long moments, as his golden glance moved in leisurely and utterly fearless scrutiny from face to face, his mental dominance held the room virtually spellbound. But then this hold was gone, as effortlessly and seamlessly withdrawn as it had been exerted, and the Lound was again just an exceptionally large, powerful, and beautiful creature. At a gentle mind nudge from the Queen, he soundlessly moved back to Leonard, and this time lay down on the floor between his and Anmar's chairs, head on paws, eyes closed, fingers of Leonard's left hand, as usual, entwined in the silken hair of his mane. The silence that had fallen after the Queen's last words lasted for quite some time, until Councillor Raday eventually spoke. "I do not know quite how to put this politely, ma'am, seeing that the creature is presumably listening to and understanding all I say?" This with the merest interrogative in her voice, eliciting nods from both Leonard and the Queen. "But we have never included any Lounds in deliberations as serious as the ones we are about to have. Is it wise to do so now?" Councillor Raday carefully avoided looking at the Lound as she spoke. Scribe Allen agreed with emphatic nods of the head, but Councillors Admeta and Padum seemed to reserve judgment on the matter, as they waited in an expectant silence. The Queen sat back in her chair and folded her arms across her breast. When she spoke, her voice was very clear and adamant. "I do not think that we can afford, even for a moment, to consider not doing so." After this definite statement, the Queen continued in a voice that held a quality of wonderment and discovery. "I have been alive for a long time, and as a practicing Lhound telepath from a very early age, I have had contact with vast numbers of Lhound and human telepaths. Leonard here is one of the strongest senders I have ever met, as is Anmar, who also has the added facet of being a sensitive, a quality that I hope and pray will aid us in healing and saving Zendra. The Queen leant forward and laid a hand on Anmar's for a brief second, at the same time allowing a calming mind send of warmth and encouragement to encompass the young woman's fraught mind. Anmar drew a deep breath and relaxed back into her chair as she sent an intensely felt wave of gratitude and respect. "But Zand," Queen Eruda continued, and shook her head. "Again, with your permission, Leonard?" And as Leonard nodded, "Zand's mind is something entirely else. I will at this stage only tell you what I do know about it. It is, first of all, quite literally the strongest mind I have ever encountered, and that includes my own." She stilled sounds of protest from around the table with a raised hand. "Yes, including my own. Secondly, Zand is also a shielder of extraordinary ability." More sounds of protest, indeed disbelief, from around the table. The Queen smiled gently, then said, "Are we agreed that Councillor Admeta is a sender of truly surpassing power and ability?" Vigorous nods all around affirmed this. Then the Queen said simply, "Admeta, mind send anything to me that you like." Then added, "Zand, shield me, please." As Councillor Admeta swept into the Queen's mind with her usual exuberance, the Queen was conscious that she was including the scribe and the other councillors in her sending, and then her powerful, confident sending was swept aside with casual, effortless ease, and replaced by a wonderfully restful layer of impenetrable velvety nothingness, shielding not just the Queen's mind, but those of the scribe and the other two councillors as well. Councillor Admeta and Scribe Allen reared back in their chairs in shock, whilst Councillors Padham and Rade leant forward and gripped the arms of their chairs in disbelieving denial. All eyes moved to the Lhound, who had not moved a muscle, and was still lying ostensibly asleep on the carpet next to Leonard's chair. The Queen and Leonard's eyes met in a moment's smiling complicity. Then Leonard laughed, reached down, and ruffled the top of Zand's head affectionately. "Stop now, you," he said, and the mind screen smoothly slid away from the others' minds. Amidst almost incoherent splutterings and questions and expressions of incredulous bafflement from the scribe and the three councillors, Queen Eruda rose to her feet. "Come," she said, "this is a good point to adjourn at. Let us all go and partake of an early noontime luncheon in the general refectory. I haven't done that for a while, and those 2 oat squares of Mistress San has just given me an appetite." After a few startled moments, everybody followed the Queen's tall figure as she strode from the room. "And we talk about nothing serious during luncheon," she called back over her shoulder. Leonard was sure that he detected an element of almost childlike glee in her voice.